When you think of gold miners, you might picture dust-covered men living in old trailers, wrestling with machines in the freezing wilderness. But what if I told you one of them? A man who came to Canada with just a couple hundred in his pocket, now lives between million-dollar properties and luxury vacations. That is Tony Beets, the self-made Dutch-born mining mogul whose empire now spans across the Yukon and beyond. But behind the fame and fortune seen on Gold Rush, Tony's story isn't one of overnight success. It's one built on decades of hardship, near-death winters, and pure, brutal determination. Today, he's worth nearly $20 million, commanding fleets of heavy machinery, and employing entire families. Yet, the man himself still lives by the same simple, rugged principles he started with: grit, loyalty, and work so hard it breaks most men. Tony Beets' rise to wealth is one of the most extraordinary transformations ever to hit reality television. Born on December 15, 1959 inches the icy farmlands of Widens, Netherlands, Tony grew up in a world where survival meant work. Winters were merciless, the kind that froze rivers solid and turned mornings into blizzards off white. His family's small dairy farm barely produced enough milk to keep them afloat. His father owned just over 50 cows, earning barely 2 guilders per animal each month. That wasn't nearly enough to feed 6 mouths. So from the time Tony could walk, he worked. By age 5, he was up before sunrise, milking cows with tiny, blistered hands, then trudging through the snow to school. Had missed class often, sometimes 40 days higher, not because he wanted to, but because the farm needed him. Every morning began before dawn and ended long after sunset. The Beets family lived in a cramped 89-square-meter farmhouse, where Tony shared a bed with his brothers until he was 14. Their mother collapsed twice from exhaustion during calving seasons. Their father worked 14-hour days until arthritis twisted his hands beyond repair. The cows produced hundreds of liters of milk each day, but after vet bills, feed costs, and equipment repairs, the family barely cleared a few hundred guilders a month. There was no luxury, no comfort, just constant effort and survival. By the age of 12, Tony had already developed the mindset that would define his life. While most boys went to church confirmation classes, Tony refused. He wasn't interested in sermons. He was interested in work. His defiance shocked the local villagers, but it also revealed something important. Tony Beets was never going to live by anyone else's rules. By his teenage years, Tony was already proving himself to be mechanically gifted. When his father bought an old 1965 Massey Ferguson tractor, a machine worth more than their yearly income, Tony took to it instantly. He learned how engines breathed, how gears sang, how to fix what broke. Once, when the hydraulic system failed, he rebuilt it using nothing but spare metal and bits off wire. That knack for engineering would one day save him millions. But back then, it was just another skill to help the farm survive. His boldness sometimes got him hurt. Like the time a cow kicked him in the chest so hard he broke 2 ribs and ended up in the hospital for nearly a week. The bill nearly sank the family's finances. Still, he recovered, worked harder, and pushed forward. He didn't know it yet, but that stubborn refusal to quit, no matter the pain or cost, would become his signature. Around 16, Tony's life took a turn in a direction no one in his small village expected. He fell in love. Her name was Minnie, a quiet, sharp, determined girl from a nearby farm just a few fields away. Their families were rivals, and her father had forbidden her from seeing any of the Beets boys. But that didn't stop Tony. They met secretly in an old barn, carving their initials into it high above the ground, as if to say their love would outlast anything on earth. When Minnie thought she might be pregnant, it terrified them both, and it nearly exposed their secret. That moment made Tony realize something critical. He couldn't spend his life tied to the same endless cycle of labor that had trapped his parents. The farm was collapsing financially, and no amount of hard work would save it. He wanted more, a future big enough to match his ambition. By 1978, Tony had done the math. The farm made around 14,000 guilders a year, but the expenses ate almost all of it. The oil crisis had tripled fuel costs, while milk prices hadn't moved in years. His own pay was about 500 guilders a month, less than minimum wage. Then came the moment that broke him. One of the family's best cows died of mastitis, and his father broke down crying over the loss. Not just because of the animal, but because of what it represented. Another blow to a life of never-ending struggle. Watching that, Tony decided he would never live like that. He'd heard rumors that in Canada, even farmhand could make double what he earned. So, in 1980, he packed his bags and left the Netherlands. He didn't just leave behind a farm, he left behind a whole life. Tony and Minnie arrived in Canada with about $1,200 between them, and barely a word of English. Their first home was a basement suite in Abbotsford, British Columbia. It was cold, dark, and smelled of mildew. Their first jobs were at a mushroom farm, the kind of place most people quit after a week. Tony worked long shifts in windowless rooms filled with the smell of rot and ammonia. Rats ran through the compost piles, and there was so thick it burned your lungs. He earned just $350 an hour. Minnie made even less sorting mushrooms. They wore their winter coats to bed because they couldn't afford to keep the heat running. Tony nearly got crushed by a forklift because he couldn't read the warning signs in English. By the end of 8 months, they both lost over 30% and were close to giving up, but they didn't. Then a twist of fate changed everything. In 1982, Tony was working construction in Vancouver when a storm blew through. The scaffolding he was standing on gave way, and he fell 30 to the ground. He cracked his skull and spent 6 days in the hospital. The accident left him battered but alive, and it came with a $10,000 payout. That money was life-changing. But what changed Tony even more was the realization that the company had ignored safety warnings before the collapse. It taught him a lesson he'd never forget: never rely on anyone else for your safety, your paycheck, or your success. From that moment on, he was determined to be his own boss. He used the pay to buy a used truck and some tools, then moved east to Alberta, where the oil boom was still strong. The pay was good, $15 an hour. And for a while, things looked promising. But then the oil market collapsed. Prices plunged from $34 a barrel to $10, and tens of thousands of workers were laid off overnight. Tony was one of them. By late 1984, he had 3 kids, ridiculed pay, and no savings. Minnie worked double shifts at a diner, coming home with burns on her hands from the grease. Tony pawned off everything they owned, even their wedding rings. They used candles to heat baby bottles. On Christmas Eve, their landlord handed them eviction papers. That night, Tony made the decision that would change his destiny. He was going north to the Yukon. He didn't know much about gold mining, but he knew 2 things. He was good with machines, and he refused to give up. He loaded an old 1976 Ford pickup with $200,000 million on it, packed a few tools, and set out for Dawson City with just $200 in his pocket. The drive was a nightmare. The truck broke down 6 times on the Alaska highway. Once the brakes failed on a mountain pass, and Tony fixed them with nothing but wire hangers and duct tape. When Hefley arrived, most bosses would have fired him on the spot. Tony instead offered to work 16-hour days until he'd made up for it. They kept him. That winter, he learned just how unforgiving the North could be. He lived in an old trailer with newspapers stuffed into the walls for insulation. Inside, the temperature hovered around -20. Outside, it dropped below -45. His heater broke constantly. He slept in every piece of clothing he owned, sometimes wrapping his feet in rags. One night, while fixing a generator during a blizzard, his hands froze. 3 fingers turned black. The local nurse told him needed to be flown out or risk losing them. Tony refused. He couldn't afford it. Instead, he soaked his hands in warm water for weeks, saving them, but losing most of the feeling in 2 fingers permanently. By spring, he had survived what many others couldn't. He was earning $1,200 a week by then, running equipment for a small mining crew. When their main excavator broke down, Tony scavenged parts from abandoned machines and had it running again within 2 days. That repair saved the crew's $150,000 season and earned him a pay raise that doubled his income. For the first time, Tony saw gold mining not just as a job, but as a business. A chance to build something real. In 1986, he leased his first mining claim near Bonanza Creek for $5,000. That summer, he pulled about 20-ounce soft gold from the ground worth around $8,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was proof he could do it. Then disaster struck again. Spring floods swept through his camp, wiping out half his gear and his shelter. He lost $4,000 in a single week. Still, he didn't quit. The next year, he teamed up with a miner named Jake Morrison, who claimed to have found rich ground. Tony invested his entire savings, $20,000, based on Jake's gold reports, but the reports were fake. They found almost nothing. Jake had already scammed 2 other miners in the same way. Tony fought him in the street and took him to court, but lost everything. He was broke again, forced to declare bankruptcy. But among the mining community, that failure didn't destroy his reputation. It made it. People respected how he'd stood his ground. He was tough, honest, and fearless. By 1988, Tony got a job with a respected miner named Big Al McGregor. It was under Al's operation that Tony's name started spreading. While working there, Tony noticed that fine gold particles were slipping through the large screens in the sleeve boxes. Had designed and built a 3-stage mesh recovery system that boosted their gold output by nearly 30%. Al rewarded him with a $50,000 bonus. Money that changed Tony's life. That same year, he fired 3 crew members for drinking on the job, earning his legendary reputation for being strict, foul-mouthed, but fair. He expected everyone around him to work as hard as he did. Then came the winter of 1989, one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to -50, and most mining operations shut down. Not Tony, he refused to stop. He welded his own repairs, built diesel-fueled heaters to keep machines from freezing, and kept digging through the ice. By spring, his crew struck a patch that produced 150 ounces of gold worth around $60,000. Tony kept half. That was enough to buy his first excavator, the machine that would make him not just a miner, but a mean owner. By 1990, Tony Beets was 31 years old, and he'd gone from a broke immigrant to the proud owner of his first mining company, Tamarack Incorporated. It was his turning point. From there, he will build an empire, 1 ounce of gold at a time. Tony Beets' success in the Klondike wasn't overnight, and it wasn't luck. It was a brutal combination of hard work, risk-taking, and a refusal to quit even when everything around him was falling apart. By the early 2000s, Tony had carved out his place as one of the most respected and intimidating miners in the Yukon. His mining operation had grown from a small-scale outfit to a full-blown empire, complete with dozens of machines, massive crews, and millions of dollars worth of claims. His gold output skyrocketed each year, sometimes reaching over 4,000 ounces of gold per season. That's millions in revenue. But even as he climbed toward the top of the industry, Tony's life was still far from easy. The work was backbreaking, and the conditions were extreme. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees, and the machinery never stopped breaking down. But Tony wasn't the kind of man to slow down. If anything, the harder the situation got, the more he thrived. What made Tony Beets so different was his complete disregard for the rules, not just in mining, but in life. He ran his operation like a battlefield general. Everyone who worked for him knew one thing. There was no room for weakness. He expected perfection, and when someone failed, he didn't hold back. He cursed, shouted, and threw things if he had to. But he also led by example. When a pump broke down, he was the first to grab a wrench. When a dozer got stuck in permafrost, he'd jump in to help dig it out. He didn't ask his workers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That's what earned him his crew's loyalty, even if they feared him at times. But behind the gruff exterior, Tony had a code. Work hard, be honest, and never cheat. That's the reason he refused to follow Discovery Channel serial scripts. When producers tried to push fake drama or scripted moments for Gold Rush, Tony walked off. He wanted a show to reflect the real grit of mining,